suppose over the course of my adult life, but the underlying theme has been driven by two sort of things. One, I'm completely colorblind, which is pretty odd
Really?
because because I see the world. I see the on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being black and white, zero being you're perfect. I'm a 9, so I see the world as if it's completely grayscale. So imagine going out in a moonlit night. So why that's relevant is because I've my father was a sailor, was a merchant marine, sailed merchant mariner for sailed around the world. His father, my uncles, everybody in my father's family, even on my mom's side of the family, they were all at sea in some way, shape, or form. So the salt water seems to run in my veins. But because I'm
Hmm.
colorblind, and I didn't find that out until I was in military college when I was well on my way to being in the Navy.
Right.
That completely sidetracked that part of my life, but that passion has always stayed with me. So go to sea, whether I wanted to do that professionally. So once I got out of the army, I wanted to go to be an academic, to be an oceanographer, to go to sea and study the oceans firsthand. But being
It,
colorblind, that limited my opportunities, and then the Canadian government decided they were going to completely defund any sort of shipboard research. So that was the end of that. That was the end of going to sea again.
oh, wow.
And so I moved away from science because I had programming skills, and I literally fell into the health niche. And I spent my whole adult sort of professional life as an IT guy.
Hmm.
Um, so I've always had my fingers in technology in that regard, even as an academic, even as a soldier, actually. So sort of that thread binds my life together. And then because I always wanted to be on a boat somehow, some way, that's always stayed with me as well. So as a young boy, I was always paddling something, or I was always trying to put a sail on something, and that culminates in 50,000 plus nautical miles at sea, most of it sailed by myself.
Though, what's really fascinating is because I can kind of relate to this.
Mm,
I have one of my classmates, because I'm currently in trade school to be an automotive technician.
hmm
One of my classmates is colorblind,
Yeah.
and he doesn't have colorblind to your extent, but
hmm
he can't see red or green.
Correct.
And what's interesting is, like, we know we're working on cars, right? Where
hmm
they have oils and fluids and different things, but he can't differentiate
hmm
between the different colors of things. This guy is like 18 years old and brilliant, like really fucking brilliant, like
Hmm.
genius. He knows his cars, he understands engines, like he has a really great grasp. I think that when it comes to craftsmanship, or even, like you said, your connection with the ocean, color plays a role, but it's not the only role that it plays, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Of course. That's. I mean, um, there's. It certainly isn't. It certainly isn't the most important role, and you can certainly substitute for it in many different ways. So it's one of those things that we can easily that we can easily compensate for. So, for example, you've always been told as a kid that the sky's blue and the grass is green.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all you need to know. You don't actually have to know what blue and green are. You just have to know when you look at the sky that that's blue, and you look at the grass that that's green. And then there's obviously there's falls in some kind of spectrum, or there's gradations there. But the point is, like you said, the color blue or the color green isn't the primary driver of of what you're seeing, or how you're reacting, or anything like that at all. There's all these other cues in our life that for people who don't necessarily see, well, who see the world sort of as I do in terms of grayscale, that we can compensate for. So you're the fellow that you're talking about, who's obviously very, very smart, brilliant, in your words, is he's able to look at a particular fluid, and he might be seeing some sort of gradation of the color, or he might be seeing something entirely
Exactly. Yeah.
that you're not looking at. So like I grew up in the prairies, so that's perfectly flat. Uh,
Midwest?
yeah, no, I'm Canadian, so basically North Dakota. Like
Oh, okay. I
so,
don't
so
know if they have that in Canada, because we have, in like here in the US, we have like the West Coast and the East
yeah,
Coast. I
yeah,
don't know how it works up in Canada. Is it
yeah.
like the
It's
opposite?
no, it's the same.
Oh, it's exact same. Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. So I live on the left coast, the same as as you guys might refer to it. But the my brother would say about the prairies, there's lots to look at and nothing to see. And that's because people who didn't grow up in the prairies are looking, oh, where's the mountain, where's the trees, where's the valleys, where are all these things that would normally draw your attention. But
Hmm.
there's, if you grew up in the prairies like I did, then there's a thousand things to see. They're just not necessarily mountains, trees and forests, but there's still every bit as much to capture your
Oh,
attention.
100.
So
Oh, 100%. I mean,
so
yeah, I mean, because like to your point, I live here in Florida,
mhm,
and Florida is flat.
yeah.
Okay,
Hmm.
flat. There ain't no mountains. There ain't no hills.
Hmm.
None of that.
Hmm.
But to your point, like there's a lot of stuff to do in Florida.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, you
Yeah. Oh
don't need
yeah.
ski resorts out here to make Florida amazing. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been to Florida. Like I guess like you can't really have a Canadian passport unless you've been to Florida. I think it's not allowed.
Yeah,
So
pretty much. Especially with British people from Britain, it's the same thing. If
yeah,
you're Irish, British, Canadian, never been to Florida, you've never been to the United States.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. So and it's flat, so I felt right at home. I mean, there's certainly a few more trees, but
Oh yeah,
I can
a little
certainly
more.
appreciate it being flat. Yeah, yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean, I'm all. I mean, if you look at it, I'm all over the map. But there's things that tie all these things together, and I'm a history buff as well. So
Oh, I
because
love
again,
history.
because I grew up in the prairies, I was literally surrounded by this amazing. I mean, it's an incredibly hard place to live. Like Fargo, North Dakota, which I'm only maybe 100 miles from Fargo, North Dakota, maybe
Uh,
120.
actually, I know where that is.
Yeah.
For one reason, is because I contacted a Native American tribe out in Fargo, North Dakota,
Yeah.
and these people are batshit crazy. All right, like
Oh yeah.
they live in insane weather. Okay,
Oh
I grew
yeah.
up in New York. You think cold is cold?
Yeah.
This is cold.
Oh yeah. 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 You have exactly.
It's really cold.
Yeah. So it's interesting that that's what you would that's what resonated with you because as a kid, I and my dad was a land surveyor, so I worked for my dad, which meant that we were outside all the time, winter, summer, spring, and fall, didn't matter. And then
Always outside.
you get an appreciation for how incredibly hard the country is, and yet people lived there. The First Nations people lived there, and
Mm-hmm.
they didn't have houses with heating. They had
Nope.
nothing. They had fire. I shouldn't say, well, to say they had nothing is completely undermines and,
Well,
and and underappreciates how amazing they were. But
their
um,
their their understanding of especially raw hides, okay, and animal skins really help them be able to survive a lot more than other Native American tribes across Canada and especially across the United States.
mhm,
A lot of these groups, again, like it comes down to if you need to survive and there's bare minimum around you, you're going to try to vitalize and use up as much of your resources to the best possible outcome you can because
mhm.
otherwise you're going to die, right?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Plain and
yeah.
simple.
Yeah, and you make a really good point, and I think it's a point that we completely that we have shaped policies around that are just horrible. So my point there is that First Nations people are testament to how incredibly adaptable humans are. So whether it's and First Nations, of course, they're trying to live in these incredibly harsh environments with nothing basically except what they can scrabble together by hand,
Hmm.
and we've sort of gotten away from that even though we've been able to adapt in amazing ways, whether it's going to the moon or whether it's being in space or whether it's reclaiming land that's under the sea, so Holland, for example, or the Mekong Delta. But we make policies that are geared towards mitigation, which humans are absolutely horrible at. We're terrible at mitigation, but we're very good at adapting. So, and anytime that you hear some sort of policy that's focused on mitigation, like for example, deciding that you are going to, if you're a billionaire, maybe by the name of Bill Gates, and you think that it's a good idea to shade the earth
Uh huh.
to
Yeah.
to you know to
That's
lower temperature,
insane.
that's
Isn't that
insane.
insane? It's
It's great. Well,
insane.
it's mitigation in its worst possible way.
In many ways, I think, like, I mean, honestly, Bill Gates has sounded like George Soros many times, but that was the ultimate George Soros analogy I've ever heard in my entire life. I
Mm,
mean, the fact that we want to, you know what, like, I've said this before so many times. If we think about it, nature is a quantum computer. It's an organic quantum computer. It creates organic materials using some sort of calculation. If that's the case, then what we're looking at is not only a complex structure of space, our planet, our atmosphere, among other things, but this is being calculated
mm.
consistently. What do you think evolution is? It's just
Yeah, yeah,
an evolved a calculation of whatever the DNA structure and molecules are coming together. That's all it is.
yeah.
It-
Well, I think that we we tend to. I mean, we have to simplify. That's the very nature of science. Like as a scientist, one of the things that I did was come up with assumptions to simplify circumstance, so then I could actually model it. So to take a look at the ocean, for example. So the science that I did. I mean, I'm going to digress a bit here to get back to your point. So
no, no, no.
as
Actually, I want you to talk about the ocean, particularly, especially with deep, like, the deep ocean creatures specifically. Also, if you want to get into that,
sure.
because
Yeah.
that in itself is fascinating.
Yes. I mean, I'm okay. Let's just jump right there. So
Yeah, let's
forget
go.
all this other crap. So,
Yeah.
so I mean, what you talked about, nature basically being this amazing computer is basically they nature herself is taking into account a billion different things all at once.
Yeah.
Where we as humans, because we're simplistic, although we're part of the natural world, in order to understand it, we have to simplify. So, what Bill Gates has done in terms of trying to simplify global warming, as for example, is that we'll shade the Earth. Well, that's one of a million variables, right? So, it's like me taking off a watch and saying I'm going to fix the watch, and by fixing it, I'm going to jam a nail into the back. So I might do that a million billion times before I actually affect a positive change. Every other thing I'm going to destroy because the watch is way more complicated than a nail, right? But as humans, you
There's
know,
multiple variables.
yeah, of course. So speaking of the deep ocean, then again we have a very simplistic view of the life, and because we're basically a two-dimensional creature, like we live on the surface of the earth, we don't fly above it except artificially. We don't
We don't
go
swim
below
in
it.
it.
We don't swim in it, so we're living on the surface. So I mean, you don't have to go to the deep ocean to be absolutely astounded by a creature. Just look at a dragonfly under a microscope if you ever
Hmm.
want to be shocked, right? Oh my god, thank god this thing isn't like 6 feet tall with a wingspan of 8 feet, because it'd eat me, right? And
Its wingspan is impeccable. I mean, they can fly better than some of the helicopters we've produced.
oh god,
Just
yeah,
the way that they can manipulate the air and move direction, like,
well, it's amazing.
it's crazy.
They fly perfectly in any direction, forwards, backwards, left, right. Doesn't.
All about the artist. That is the whole purpose of this podcast, period. And you have a really valuable tool. You can share this with artists, people that are creative, someone that can enjoy this podcast and really enjoy the experience of Lost in the Groove. So, with that, let's jump back to today's episode, shall we?
Make any difference, and they can change that directionality based on, like, in an instant. And if you ever watch them hunt, it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking, because they're what they're eating is minuscule. You can barely see it with your eye, and they just drill it every single time. So they have the ability, they have an intelligence beyond ours in that one particular aspect. But then if you look at, of course, that's just a dragonfly. But if you look in the deep ocean, it's even 1,000, it's 100,000 times more shocking,
Like
because the environment
angelfish.
because the environment is 100,000 times more extreme, right? It's
Yeah.
it's so and I mean I mean for one thing, the deep ocean is a desert in every way that that you can imagine a desert minus the heat. There's nothing to eat, and there's nowhere to hide.
No.
Except there's creatures that live and thrive there and somehow manage to find breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Well,
So,
What's
so
what's
it's just shocking.
fascinating? What's fascinating also, some of these creatures have developed to have bioluminescence.
Hmm.
and basically be almost invisible. Like their skin is translucent.
Hmm.
Like, and then you have to wonder, there's a reason why they developed like that because of the harsh conditions that they're in. I mean, think about the creatures that live in the Sahara Desert. It's particularly even mammals. A lot of them, they're super tiny,
Hmm.
they're super fast, and they're super light.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, obvious reasons. There's nothing to eat,
Hmm.
and you got to be really fast if you're small, because otherwise you're somebody else's lunch, breakfast, and dinner.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I mean, there's there's a million reasons plus. There's probably a billion reasons why that creature living in the desert is that way. And and we can, if we're really smart, we could probably name 100 or 200.
Oh
But
yeah,
we're a long ways away from the
but
million or billion that's required. And what's actually to go
yeah,
take that one step farther,
sure,
the DNA that separates us from an earthworm, we're in the order of 90+% the same in terms of our DNA as an earthworm. So the differences are actually very small in terms of percentages. So the way that the building blocks of the creatures that are living in the deep sea or on the Sahara Desert or you and I or an earthworm are unbelievably malleable and the same. It just takes a few tweaks here and there and here and there and here and there. And I think I mean that's one of the places I think that we'll see. I know on healthcare because I have an IT background and my fingers are currently in the in that space. You're going to see AI make changes in the healthcare industry that even a year ago, 18 months ago, would have been absolutely unheard of. Whether it's cancer drugs or whether it's hyper focused, whether it's hyper focused pharmaceuticals to address very, very, very specific, uh, well, I'll say challenges,
yeah.
because it doesn't have to be a disease. It might just be something you're unhappy with. So it's going to make these unbelievable changes, and it's also going to find out. It's also going to discover and shed light on our DNA and take us to a place that we could not possibly have imagined even
Well,
even a year ago.
I think also the benefits of artificial intelligence will give us a better understanding. I mean, even particularly with science, people want to shed a dark light, but the key to possibly space travel, the key to better understanding our oceans, the key to better understanding our environment may in fact be artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence in many ways kind of acts like mother nature. Like you said, you take a creature that is 90% similar in DNA to humans, but yet that 5%, sorry, not 10%, my apologies, that 10% creates the difference between a human and an earthworm.
Mm.
So you have the same prompt that outputs two different variables
Hmm.
based on, again, like literally a very small margin of percentage.
Hmm.
You know, you want, you could always look at things from a negative lens, but there's so much more positive coming from this array than we have seen from other things in the past.
Well, I think I think our perceptions, well, our historical precedent would say that humans aren't very good at adapting technology, in the sense that the first thing they choose to do with it is look to exert
Mhm.
power in some way, shape, or form. So, I
Politicize
mean,
it, possibly.
so we talked about indigenous peoples, right off the bat. One of the first big technological advances that indigenous people got were by the Dutch, actually. You say you're from when they arrived in the New World in New York, or what they called New Amsterdam. They had no compunction about trading guns for furs, for pelts, whereas in Canada it was slightly different, certainly at that time. But the first thing that First Nations people did, and I'm not signaling out First Nations people living here. This is true of humans across the globe.
Yeah.
As soon as there was a technological bump, they used that to force. So in the case of First Nations, they used a gun to force people without guns out of their territories, out of their hunting grounds, out of their spiritual, out of the land that was important to them. If you look at British, for example, as soon as they were able to extract the levers of sea power, they became a world force. Look at nuclear weapons. I mean, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what technology. Look at, I mean, if you look at computer technology, look at the ability to fly. Look at the ability to look at the canoe, something that's close to my heart. Look at, as soon as people were able to leverage that in some way, shape, or form, they managed to exert themselves in a way that wasn't necessarily, for the betterment of all. So taking
Yeah.
a step away from AI, it's very easy for us to look at the, like you had said, to look at the dark side, right? Which is part of the human condition, I suppose.
Hmm.
But hopefully, we're a little more mature um, as a species, if I can be so general, to think that there's way more benefit to come from it. And I think there's, that that's a that's a really big ask, because one of the mistakes that we make is that everyone else is like us and they aren't. So people coming from different cultures, people coming from different places, people coming from different geographies, for example, they have different immediate pressing concerns.
Oh yeah, for
Um,
sure.
so I mean, and we talked about Indigenous peoples and being adaptable. And look at the Inuit people living up north; they have fundamentally different concerns going forward. Pushing, making sure that they're living their best life than someone who's living, say, in Fiji, right? There's
Yeah,
completely different. They have completely
completely
different
different lives.
problems. So
Yeah.
it's very hard then to take something like that has this blanket possibility like AI, and have whoever's in charge of it. We're going to ask them to be mature enough to make sure that this is something that benefits everybody and not just a few. So
I mean, and it's also its ability, because again, it doesn't come with all of the issues and problems we humans come with. When you can apply it to, for example, just going through. Hold on one second. My apologies. Forgot to turn
yeah,
off my phone.
no
Um,
worries. I locked
so
mine away.
I try to. Uh, so when you look at, for example, with artificial intelligence, where it doesn't have all of these problems that human beings have,
Hmm.
and you take something, for example, like historically different types of writing, or for example different artifacts that we have that we're not able to interpret because of our limited understanding,
Mm.
you have a, a thing called artificial intelligence that can take everything, run it through a program, and be able to come up with a proper script, a proper direction that you can take to be able to translate whatever you're trying to do. These are just some of the advancements that we have. I mean, imagine being able to, like, we sent over a rover over to Mars that had artificial intelligence. Imagine if you could take something like that and put it at the bottom of the ocean and just have that thing with a crew of 3 or 4 and just go around, come back up, whatever you got to do, make sure to keep those things maintained, keep that mission for a couple of months. Do you know how much information we would learn from the bottom of our ocean
Hmm.
having those things down there?
Hmm.
It's incredible.
Well, I think that, I mean, there's a caveat here too, is that
Yeah, for sure.
so as a programmer, and I've been a programmer for a long time. So and we've been living. If you'll forgive the pun, or pardon the pun, we've been, swimming in a sea of AI for a long time. We've
Hmm.
just decided to call it AI now. So
It's not
and
really AI, but that's what it's called.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so there's still a chance. I mean, and this is something that ChatGPT has struggled with. It's, Gemini has struggled with it. Basically, every early form of AI as we know it has struggled with, is that it's fine tuned based on a programmer's perspective, right? You can, if you're fine tuning or you're programming AI, you're still deciding what you're going to feed it, right? So there's and people were pretty good at the beginning when ChatGPT first came out, of getting, keep prompting ChatGPT till it would start hallucinating, which is literally making stuff up, or keep prompting it, or finding out if there were biases in whatever they were tuning it with. And that's an issue that, ChatGPT, that's an issue that everyone is going to struggle with. I mean, Elon Musk has XAI. He's got something coming out in the next little while, which he says is, well, he's I hate to say promoting, but he's certainly touting it as being free of any of the biases that that currently exist. So it's important. Like this is it's what I call the field of dreams fallacy from the movie Field of Dreams, where they
Mm-hmm.
if you build it, they will come. So
Mm-hmm.
the-
Yeah.
um,
Very true.
it's not entirely true that just because if you build AI that the outcome that you want is just gonna manifest itself out of that. So there's there's a good deal of concern about AI as we know it having having everything bad about it. Because firstly, like for example, there was some research done by there was a couple of scientists who published about maybe 6 or 7 months ago, and they're both these guys are very well known. They're exceptional scientists, and what they were doing were they were looking for cancer drugs. And the problem with it's a sticking a pin in the back of a watch problem. There's way
Mm-hmm.
more thing. There's way easier to screw. It's much easier to make you sick than it is to make you better. So
Mm-hmm.
they would spend all this time figuring out how proteins, because proteins are an incredibly complex molecule. It's how we're one of the ways that we're built. But they were trying to understand how they could build proteins so that they could latch onto cells and cell receptors and do this in a way that's actually beneficial. And there's a million ways to do that wrong and very few ways to do it right. So they were
Mm-hmm.
using AI, and the prompts that they were using, very sophisticated prompts, were basically telling it to be safe, come up with the safest way to do this. And it was astonishing. And then they thought, wait a second, this is all public knowledge. We're not coding all this AI stuff itself. We're just prompting an existing model. How about we give it the opposite prompt, which is come up with the most lethal, you know, with the most lethal drugs that you can. And and they thought, okay, well, it's going to come up with one or two, no big deal. So they went to sleep and they came back the following morning, which is how long it takes these things to run, because proteins are in the order of one there's basically a billion or so different ways to fold a protein. So it's a very complicated problem. And they came back in the morning and there were something like 50,000 hypertoxic drugs that they had never even imagined that were capable of killing a massive swath of the human population. Is like, oh my god, what have we done? So they put the brakes on everything and then went to the government and said, hey, maybe this is something we should be looking at. So there's this, I'm not trying to put the fear of God into anybody. I'm just saying, like, there's two scopes, there's two ways, right? And the prompts, we need to have AI that's that's truly agnostic, which is completely unbiased, and that's a problem. It's hard to do.
It is. Well, that in itself is the next evolution,
Hmm.
which is where it's be able to be non-bias,
Hmm.
where it's you know I'm not a programmer, but I am a little bit computer savvy, and I do kind of veer towards electronics, particularly with the automotive industry. But there is a way of being able to have what you call an automated program that automatically fixes its own programming
Hmm.
and be able to make its own complex decision making. But there is a level where people have to understand, like what you were saying. There's a side that definitely expresses all of the issues and problems that can definitely lead to really bad places.
Hmm.
I mean, let's be honest. I mean, we're dealing with people,
Hmm.
and people will do people will do things for selfish reasons,
Hmm.
monetary gain. I mean, there's a lot of different ways people can put their poker chips down on the table.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And I think the only thing I would add is that we live on a razor's edge all the time and take it completely for granted. Like, we talked earlier about how difficult it was for people to live in Fargo, but by the same token, if you were to suddenly scrub all the niceties of home that you have living in Florida, suddenly living out on the beach gets pretty hard pretty quick, right? So it's and even one of the examples I like to use is if you're screaming down the highway at 70 or 80 miles an hour, and just a couple feet over there on the left hand side someone's going the opposite way at 80 or so miles an hour, and you never give it a second thought. And of course, people die horribly every year in head on collisions, and it's a very real possibility, but we just blow it off as never happening. So that just speaks to, again, how we live on this really, really, really thin line. And yet,
Do you, Do you
And
remember? Do you remember the in Hawaii they had the fires?
yeah, in Lahaina. Yeah, yeah.
And what happened? Like that was it. It happened. Like we heard for 2 weeks.
Hmm.
I mean,
Oh,
or is there? Did the
yeah.
houses get rebuilt? Are they okay?
Oh, I mean, there's
Nothing
lots to
happened.
talk about. There's lots to talk about in the fire in Lahaina. I mean, over and above it being preventable, because it
Very
had happened
preventable.
before. It happened in 2018, actually, for exactly the same reason. It just wasn't so. It just meteorological conditions weren't perfect for it to completely devastate the whole town. When the 2018 fire came along, it was caused by the same reason, and they identified those reasons, and of course it was devastating, but not to the extent of this most recent one. But the point is that, um, and we talked about this earlier, they came up with policies to mitigate the damages, and of course they failed because we're really poor at that. But to your point,
Yeah.
um, my mom would say that, well, she's passed away, but my mom would say that, um, the veneer of civilization is very, very thin. So it doesn't take very much, just like a kind tiny scratch on the surface, and suddenly we're all cavemen, right? And and I mean, uh, yeah, anyway. So, AI has the potential to make a very deep scratch on the surface of civilization, and heaven forbid, if everything sort of goes the wrong way. So it's good to balance. In my mind, it's always good to understand that we live on this razor's edge, and it's nice to know, when you're straying a little bit, because
Yeah.
the results tend to be catastrophic, like the
Yeah.
fire in Lahaina, right?
Yeah.
And then because our attention spans are so short, we just go, oh well, I guess, too bad for those guys. What's for dinner?
Hey, they got Oprah and Dwayne Johnson out there. They should be okay. They got tons of
Yeah.
tequila.
Mm.
Got tons of prep talks. They'll be fine. They'll be
Yeah.
fine. They're
Yeah. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
But it's just it's a strange notion also, because there is this kind of getting a little more sci-fi. There is this unprecedented of visitors or travelers
Hmm.
that have come. I mean, there are depictions of this scattered across, Babylonian. You have with the Egyptians. You have with the Greeks. It just goes on. But it seems like almost we're now. It's kind of hard to believe. Like we know that there are billions of planets. We know kind of an understanding of how planets such as ours are formed. So to say that there isn't any possible life out there besides ours, on the contrary, that are just as intelligent as we are, and maybe even more intelligent than we are, and maybe they have the ability to time travel or space travel, what do you want to call it? I think it's very plausible. I think it's very
Hmm.
possible for those things to exist. I just think that we as humans just have a very hard time of understanding things that we have never experienced before.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, part of the issue is, again, from a scientific perspective. One of the things that you should never do is look at a mystery that's a mystery, and then explain it with a bigger mystery. So that's the cardinal sin. So if you make an extraordinary claim, you have to have extraordinary proof. So if I said to you, hey, there's a Sasquatch in the room right behind me, you'd go, Bert, I'm looking behind you. There's no Sasquatch. But I go, oh no,
Right.
there's one there. So if I'm going to make an extraordinary claim, I better have extraordinary evidence. So, and there's plenty of evidence that it seems to be that there's plenty of evidence about other people visiting Earth. Like I think it's and I want to stay away from using things that are mysterious, like how in the world did they build things in Central America? How do they build these massive structures, using stones that we can barely move today, and put them, and then put them together, or place them in such a fashion that you can't slip a piece of paper between them? Like we have a very difficult time, doing that sort of building, and we certainly couldn't do it with the tools that we imagine they had. So there's all kinds of mysteries
Yeah,
around there, and it's.
there's also this notion too, where I was throwing this idea with a friend of mine. She's also on the podcast, where if you think about it, we evolved the way that we did because of the environment and our planet. Okay, the possibility that other intelligent life developed the same way that we did, like to your point, it's like saying there's Sasquatch right behind you. Even going even crazy to the idea, there could be intelligent life forms that are completely made out of metal, head to toe, completely metal. How is that possible? We don't know, but that is a possibility. There is a possibility of having even something gaseous made out of gas that is alive. But again, with our limited understanding and our like central focus that humans are made out of skin and flesh and bone, there could be other forms of intelligent life forms out there in the universe that don't look like us, are not structured like us at all.
Oh yeah, I mean, if we ever came across intelligent life, like face to face, or
Yeah.
even virtually, like you and I are doing,
Yeah.
it would be by definition wildly different. We wouldn't recognize it because the way that we've evolved, the way that this planet has evolved, all these things are if you ignore the religious underpinnings and connotations, it's a complete and utter accident. So if you look at all the things that had to conspire to make the Earth, it's a mind-numbingly large array of accidents. So
Yeah. Such as our
it's
moon forming, such as
yeah,
Jupiter
yeah,
saving
yeah.
Earth.
I mean,
There's so many.
getting hit by asteroids at just the right time. The list goes on and on and on and on. And it's a mind-numbingly. I mean, the if you had to sit down and come up with a statistic that would say what's the probability of happening, it would be almost zero. But
Right.
the universe is so large that almost zero ends up being a very, very large number if you multiply that by, say, 100 billion planets. And uh, the interesting, one of the interesting things about quantum mechanics in particular, if I mean, whenever I hear someone start talking about quantum mechanics, I always think the next thing I hear is bullshit. So you'll
No,
have
no, no.
to.
I listen. I love pseudoscience. Okay.
So one of the things about quantum
Kidding.
mechanics
I'm kidding.
is that
Yeah.
there's the many worlds theory, or the many universe.
Mm-hmm.
There's a multiverse, right? So there's no difference probabilistically from a universe that evolves with just us in it and one that evolves with many forms, not just us. So from a quantum perspective, we can say, yeah, the whole universe was created. It's just ours. It's just that's part of one of the multiverse. There's another universe that's full of intelligent life and it's all metal. And there's another one that's full of intelligent life and it's all gaseous. And there's another one that's intelligent life and it only looks like us. Full stop. Period. So you can make an argument from a science that from the single most tested, most reliable piece of science, and that's quantum. That's quantum mechanics as we know it today. So there's it's an unbelievably interesting question, and you can go to you end up in 1,000 different rabbit holes, right? So,
Yeah.
but which again, I suppose the most interesting thing about it to me is that we as humans are able to we've been given some special place to be able to understand things on a very, very small scale, say the quantum scale, and things on a massive scale, which is a universal scale. So just imagine that for a minute. You can understand things at the Planck length, which is 10 to the minus 67, which is to say, if the Planck length were blown up to something that of our sort of experience, that one Planck length would be the full extent of the universe away from us. That's how large it is. That's how tiny that 10 to the minus 60, 63 I
Hmm.
think is. But my point is that we still have the ability to have an understanding about that and then to apply it to science and then use that science to make predictions like DNA and like quantum computing, for example, which is nothing more than understanding just in the name itself, right? So we have this special gift that allows us to have these, firstly, to be inquisitive enough to ask the questions that would lead to good answers, like, is there a multiverse, or this is special relatively right, or what's the nature of the life that's living on the bottom of the ocean, and
Yeah.
it's worth it. I mean, and think about that. The really the thing about that that's really interesting is that you say, okay, well, let's create an AI robot that crawls the bottom of the ocean and sends us information back about something, just so we can learn more. But there's implicitly what you're saying is that there's some good to be derived in that, right?
Yeah.
So you've made a value judgment about knowledge, about the pursuit of knowledge being a higher being a higher goal, right? The current state I'm in right now would be better if I were to pursue knowledge in a way that's good, right? As opposed to give me a way to create 100 drugs that could kill 100,000 people,
Well,
right? So,
they did that with I think it was the like I said earlier with the Curiosity mission that went to
hmm
Mars
hmm
was if I'm not mistaken, the rover got damaged, and because it
hmm
had artificial intelligence built in, it was able to figure out on how to repair itself, to be able to get itself out of the ditch, and like this was the first time ever that not only were you able to send something to Mars, but you knew that the reliability that it was able to care for itself. Now I know that they're like building something that's even better than what they had before, but that just goes to show you just the small benefit in a
hmm
very large scale
hmm
all the way in Mars. um I don't know, it's just I think we're at, like you said, like at the very beginning of this.
hmm
It's
hmm
kind of like we're like the 1920s of the 21st century, if
yeah,
that
I
makes
mean,
sense.
oh yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really good analogy. Can you imagine what the Wright brothers would have, if you would have asked them, what's the future of flying? Give me the it's 19, what was it, 1901 or something when they first flew. I forget the exact date, but let's say the early 1900s. You say, what's the future of flying going to look like in 40 years? They would have they never in their wildest dreams would they have come up with it. And
Well,
and
look at
my my
well, look
my
at planes.
grandfather,
Look at planes
yeah,
from 1900 to 1920, then
it's crazy.
1920 to 1940, then 1940. By
Yeah.
1950, we had jets. Hey, it's Dave, and I quickly just wanted to jump in and say if you've been enjoying the podcast, I'm enjoying this episode, if you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, that'll be so greatly appreciated. Because here's the thing, someone might read that review and make the choice if they want to listen to the podcast. You get to help grow this podcast with us. How fucking cool is that? Let's jump back to today's episode.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? It's
Mind
crazy.
blowing!
So
Crazy!
my grandfather, um,
Yeah.
he was uh, he was born in, I want to say 1898.
Oh, wow.
So of
A
course,
little bit ago.
a little bit ago, but he couldn't. So he was alive when they walked on the moon, and there's no way. And he was just absolutely gobsmacked because there's no way in his life when he was a kid that he would have imagined. I mean, firstly, airliners, because there were no airliners when he was born, right?
No.
And forget airliners, just people going to the moon, right? And then, or forget that, just forget now that we have, we have satellites that are at the end of the, beyond the solar system into deep space. I mean, it's mind numbing how far we've come in given some really, really primitive technology. So imagine what AI would do that. Imagine if you turned AI loose on the Wright brothers, airplane, and said, okay, we'll fix this. Can you imagine what that would look like? So,
I'll throw you a bone even further.
mm,
Imagine giving AI to Leonardo da Vinci.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
first off, he'd think you're bringing him some witchcraft from another civilization. He'd probably go, but I mean, if you think about it, if you gave Leonardo da Vinci AI, the AI would basically be able to tell them and say, "Hey, listen, I don't think it's a good idea to have the bird wings flapping." Because I know that birds do that, but it's not really the way that it works with a plane. If you figure out to like make rudders and you have it positioned and it's like, oh, okay, he may have invented the plane 500 years ago.
hmm
Okay, that's kind of a what if, but it's a what if that's like, wow, if 21st century went back that far, you just see how quickly things adapt and evolve than it has in the past.
hmm
We went from change being every 3,000 years to 2,000, then 1,000, then 100,
hmm
75, 50. You see where I'm going with this?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that one of the dangers is that as humans, we are not wired. We are not hardwired to adapt at that pace. We're just not. It's
No,
one of the reasons why. It's one of the reasons why socially, kids kids. I shouldn't say kids. I should say that we as humans are not understanding the full scope and extent and pitfalls of social media, for example, because we're not evolved to communicate in that way, shape, or form. So, and I mean, that's a very, very crude example, but look at, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that if you told someone that you would travel faster than a horse could run, that they just figured, well, you'd die because you wouldn't be able to survive, the speed and the acceleration and
What wasn't
deceleration.
that insane thing about women in trains? They couldn't be in there because otherwise their stomachs would explode.
It's just
There's some wild stuff back
so
then.
so that speaks to how dumb we are when it comes to new technologies, right? And the barriers that are up against them to adopt them. And of course, in an evolutionary context, if we weren't hardwired not to accept the crazy things right out of the box, we'd be dead as a species, right? um, it's one of the reasons that we've managed to survive, is that because we tend to be sort of skeptical about new things, like skeptical in a curious sense, and
Yeah.
ask questions. But the changes are coming at us so fast, and they're generally so wildly beneficial that we're playing catch up, and that's problematic. Which is why everyone is saying, oh, AI, people are gonna it's gonna turn into Terminator, and pretty soon, they're gonna be our bosses, and
Well,
that's just human nature sort of pushing back at the
well,
pace.
that's one way, but the thing is that like, okay, I'm a Star Trek fan. I love Star Trek, and I
Okay.
think Star Trek kind of summed up artificial intelligence high, basically like it has life. I forgot the term. It's called there's a term for it, but anyway, it's where basically like AI reaches like sentient. Sorry,
Hmm.
that's the word.
Yeah, yeah. I was
Sentient
gonna say
life.
that, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But when it reaches sentient like sentience, it has this way of almost trying to understand both sides where you're coming from.
Hmm.
So it's not figuring out if you're right or wrong. It's trying to figure out why are you right and why are you wrong? And if you're wrong, why is that wrong? And if you're right, why is that right? Does that kind of
Hmm.
make sense? It has
Yeah.
its own ability and form. I think
Well,
if it doesn't have all that human characteristics attached to it, you can't have a Terminator.
I think, well, there's two things I think that you raised, at least two, and right off the bat, I mean, you have to define sentience. And we would have we as humans, again, would have a very limited perspective of what that
Yeah, for
is,
sure.
because we're humans. Like, if I asked that question to a creature who you might have referred to earlier, who is wholly metallic completely, they might have a different idea of what sentience is. So let's just agree, for the sake of, for not going down a rabbit hole. But the question you asked really is moral. Like, how do you give AI some a moral compass? Because we as humans have a moral compass, and that moral compass transcends culture, transcends almost transcends species. I shouldn't say that. It certainly transcends culture. It transcends different societies, transcends civilization. So we have this idea of what how we should be morally oriented, and the fear is generally that AI will not share that same moral compass. So,
No.
and the lame, I shouldn't say lame, but I guess the overgeneralized Terminator example is that they will have no moral compass, and they'll wipe out humanity because their moral compass is wildly different than ours, right? So the fear is, how do we give them a moral compass that's unbiased, right? And how do you give them a moral compass that's still aligned with what we would generally, which is what we would generally want. So it's a really tough question, and I mean, it's so unbelievably wide open.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, because we really don't know what we've created. We really don't know what we've done with AI, right? It's like, what actually have I done? It's like, it's Shelley's version of Frankenstein. What have I actually created? Shelley had no in the novel. He had no idea what he created with Frankenstein. What have I done? What have I turned loose on? I've created life, but now what have I done, right?
You've made a monster.
You've made a monster. So,
Yeah.
that's where we are,
I
poking
think
around with Frankenstein.
I think also like there's almost a trauma factor. People forget like from 2001 Space Odyssey,
Yeah, yeah,
right? With the red eye.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, That was creepy. Okay, I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
like real ass creep. That would traumatize a generation to like, that's like the predecessor of Terminator.
Hmm.
But I think like again, our understanding of intelligence is very minimal
Yeah.
because I think eventually I would assume when we do interact with other species, whether if they're coming from the multiverse or coming from other places, we may start to now understand that there are different forms of communication. There
Hmm.
are different laws of physics, not different type, different like the laws of physics that still apply that may interact differently, like you said, in a multiverse, or
Yeah.
may evolve differently on another planet. I mean, I remember I was reading an article. I don't know if it was from NASA. They found a planet that has life, not life, like like it kind of shows sign of like water and it shows like rock formations and vegetation. But this planet evolved with two moons. So it has one small moon and it has one large moon. And one of the theories is like the way that this planet formed was it was one big planet, then it got broken up and it had two other pieces that basically expanded out and became its moon. So its two moons was once a part of its own planet.
Hmm.
So it's kind of again, kind of we're talking about like the manipulation of how our planet formed. Other planets that have organic life or show signs of organic life have these other forms of manipulation that they apply. I don't know if I
Yeah.
said that correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, if we just take a step back to what you said earlier about different kinds of physics, I mean, we know that our own universe is full of dark matter. We have no idea what
Hmm.
that is. We can't see it. We can't sense it. Well, we can sense it only through its gravitational interaction with other bodies. But it's out there, and we don't have and it's part of dark energy. It's all these things that we don't know. But it's a huge part of our universe. So, and if it weren't a part of our universe, even though it might be so far away from us that that it seems to be irrelevant, it's still part and parcel of those interactions on a cosmic scale that have brought us to this point. So again, to what you had said, there's a planet that split apart for whatever reason. It's now two moons, and that's part of its evolution. And it's anything on that planet or on those bodies, they are, because they're linked in that way, they have this very common thread that binds them all. So we have no idea, we should have a very limited idea of the thread that binds us to our moon, to the sun, to the solar system, to the rest of everything, and then to whatever else is potentially sentient in the universe. So you know it's a fascinating thing to think about, and it's really interesting to think about in terms of, like, we're talking about science. We could talk about that and say cultural, in a cultural perspective, which you brought up earlier about, look, as Babylonians, they have, there's these depictions of things that we can't describe, and those things meant, you can see those things, in Egypt,
Clear
you
as
can see them,
day.
and
Clear
you
as
can
day.
see
Like
them.
there's pictures on Google right now. You can go online right now and you could find them.
Yeah, I mean, look at in South America on the Nazca Plains, where the only way that
Yeah.
you can actually see those structures is from above, and there's no mountains to look at. That you got to be in something that's actually well above the ground. So there's all kinds of amazing uh, mysteries, let's say, that so, and they're cultural. They're not scientific in that regard. They're cultural. So why do they exist? And I mean, that's a whole nother I mean, there's lots to talk about there as well, but I mean that the way to look at it scientifically, to me, is interesting, because you can look at how well we're able to describe something, like, let's say, tides, because we're talking about the moon. We have a very good idea how the tides work, and then take that same level of introspection, and then apply that to some of the to some bigger mysteries that may be metaphysical, or that may be, so metaphysical in the sense that they're not well described by by the science that we're typically used to. So we live in really interesting times, I think, because these questions, like you said, look at Leonardo. So look at, I mean, as unbelievable a mind as he must have had, imagine the tools that he had at his disposal, to probe, right? to probe the world. But now imagine what we have now. So sitting there with your phone, you can bump up some AI that has the ability to answer questions that you might ask that nobody could answer even a year ago. Just you on your phone alone, sitting there. I got nothing to do for the next 20 minutes. I think I'll ask some interesting questions, right? So our ability to probe has grows like you had described earlier. It's growing exponentially. Like think of an airplane, 100 years ago, 80 years ago, 20, 30, whatever, right? And I mean, ask yourself. I don't think anybody knows what an airplane is going to look like in 80 years from now. I mean, other than it's going to have something that can fly through the atmosphere, but what that looks like, who knows, right?
We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't
And
know.
that's crazy to think about, right? Because we take airplanes or cars or that stuff like for granted. I mean, what's food going to look like 80 years from now?
Well, I can tell you that even from the car industry,
Mm,
people like to shit on electronics because, to be very honest, most cars today are kind of like your refrigerator. It's an appliance.
mm,
There's mostly wires and components that are attaching, making everything to work. But the reality is that we've gotten so advanced now where we can basically make cars have less wiring, make them safer, and more proactive. So your car is able to do things that you physically as a human being cannot do as responsive. I mean, it's doing things in a matter of a fraction of a second
hmm
at speeds. And you're talking about a computer that is able to manipulate its own code, going back and forth through its programming again in a fraction of a second. All of these things is all thanks to advancement and development, where we're able to make things now that are better than us,
hmm
that are better, not only better than us, more capable than us,
hmm
don't need as much sleep than us, require a lot less to do a lot more.
hmm Yeah, I think that's. I mean that if you were to say that to someone, I think the first reaction might be to. I mean, it's easy to see how the first reaction might be something like, "Oh my God, that's terrible." But
Right,
let's
obviously.
let's take a step back and think. We talked. I just said about food. Like we are able to produce more food now than we were ever before. And
Hmm.
it's wonder and we eat better now than anyone in history has ever eaten. Certainly, and I mean not globally across the world. So let's just say that to begin with.
Yeah.
Let's just clump this to us. But the technology exists. So I mean, and look at medicine. Look at the advances in medicine. Look look at the advances in
Yeah.
transportation, like which is what you're talking about. So there's nothing wrong with look at the advance. I mean, think of the surgical table. Think of all the surgery that now that's done, robotically
Yeah.
with remote sensing. So think that there's nothing wrong with getting a machine to do something better than us, as long as that's properly oriented. Like it's
Hmm.
easy for you could say as to look at the other side of the coin. It's easy to make a machine that's a lot better at killing another human than I would be, right?
Yeah.
That's not an issue. You can do that, but it's not that isn't properly directed advancement, right? That's just
It's,
wrong.
to your point, if you take, for example, nuclear, right? Nuclear can be used to make really terrible bombs that can wreak havoc and destroy this entire planet. But it has other benefits. It
Mm,
can be used to help advance our energy problem and crisis that we have in the United States and in Canada
hmm
and across the entire world. Again, it's like, how are you going to utilize it? Are
hmm
you going to utilize it as a weapon, or are you going to utilize it as the ultimate tool? Because that's what computing has become. It's become the
Yeah.
ultimate tool. That's what, you know, it has a negative cognitive to it, but like that's kind of what bioengineering is, particularly with food. These are what those benefits are. It allows
hmm
us as a civilization to flourish
hmm
and
And
become better and better. Yeah.
yeah, I think that I mean, and not only our civilization, but civilization, globally. So you can go to
Yeah.
countries who are struggling with energy, like the low cost energy is the underpinning of all things, good, basically.
Yeah.
So the thing that and we talked about this very briefly earlier. The thing that we have not yet done is give moral compass to the things that that we create, other than coming up with a set of rules. Like, for example, the car, using the autonomous braking system in new cars, where if the car itself senses, however you define, however it's doing that, that a crash is imminent, then it does something. So so that's a very simple moral compass. Crash good, no crash, or crash bad. No crash good. So sorry about that. So
No, no,
and
that's
then
okay.
if we turn that, if we if we say, okay, AI, come up with your own moral compass, then that's the issue, right? Because
I don't think it
do-
needs a moral compass to
wait,
be
I think
sufficient.
I would push back on that. I would say it has to have a moral compass. It has to.
Well, define what you mean by a moral compass for AI. I'm just want to hear your perspective on this.
Well, in the lack, okay, let me say that, if in the lack of any kind of moral compass, then anything is good. All things are equally good, which off the which at the in your heart of hearts, that's completely untrue. That just leads to chaos.
Yeah,
There has to be some sort of stacking. There has to be some sort of hierarchy that you assign to those things that you perceive. Otherwise, if in the lack of a moral compass that's certainly shared across, for example, across humans, then it's every man for himself, and all that
yeah,
matters is how much power I can have. So
right.
if you look in the natural world, if you put 100 chimpanzees into a room, all they would do is kill each other.
Yeah, 100%.
If you put
Because
a
chimp.
hundred thousand if you
y-
put 100,000 people into a football stadium, they're all happy and glad, right? Except for
Yeah,
those. So it's a very, this idea of a shared moral compass. Even if you look at a game, like if you look at a football game when there's 100, it's a massive number of people
I
to put into
know.
a small
These
space.
stadiums are humongous.
And except for the odd exception, there's fights aren't breaking out, and people aren't being murdered or thrown off the top, and people are drinking and still having a good
There
time.
are fights.
Oh yeah, sure, it
There are
happens.
fights at football games.
Oh, of
Yeah.
course. Of course it happens, but it's the exception, right? It's not the
Right.
rule. But
Obviously, yeah.
if you and so that speaks to the necessity of a moral compass, I think, in the most general terms.
But then, there's the idea of then what defines the moral compass for the AI? Because, you know, let's be honest. I mean, there has been a layer of manipulation of bias and political endeavors and direction that has been
Mhm.
inputted with these things. So, who then defines what moral compass does the AI have, or does the
Yeah.
artificial intelligence have to create its own form of morality?
Well, I think you've that's a $64,000 question, right? You can't have, you know, I mean, clearly, we talked about this earlier a little bit as well, is that there's, different cultures, different societies, different times, different everything has come up with different ideas of what's right and wrong. So what actually is right and wrong? And there's a thread that binds all that, but the thread is rather tenuous. And if you look at the United States as an example, the United States is the most successful, um, it's the most successful, freest country in the world, bar none. And it's managed to achieve that the status as the greatest country the world has ever seen in an incredibly short period of time. Because the Romans, for example, were around for about 2,000 years. Greeks, maybe 1,500 years. Egyptians might have been
3,000.
2,500 years,
Yeah.
3,000. But they never the they never ascended to the heights that the United States has in such an incredibly short period
And
of
in many
time.
ways, is kind of a new form of the Roman Empire.
Sure. Which is something to say that maybe the moral compass that's underpinning the way that the United States has evolved. Maybe there's something to be said about that, as opposed to, say, the Aztec Empire, or maybe the Egyptians, or maybe the Comanches. The largest empire that's ever existed in the Americas were the Comanches. So you can't say, well, no, let's take those guys as our moral exemplars. That might not be the best thing to do.
Yeah, I don't think the Comanches. Yeah, if you live like the Comanches, you'll understand why very quickly.
Yeah, yeah. I guess, one way of picking what that moral compass might be is to look at the moral compasses that have existed. Like, look at the choices we have as moral compasses, because you can't say, well, I'm just going to pick a new one, because that's experimenting on a global
There,
scale, and that's
when you already have others that have already been experimented on, right? Going back to the idea of like telling the AI to find all of the most dangerous, the most lethal. It's kind of
hmm
the same way where you already have somewhat of a map with a
hmm
plethora of options of morality that have existed
sure.
thousands of years. I mean, we have tablets, we have things been carved out in walls. It's not like we don't have information. We
Oh yeah,
do
yeah,
to a
yeah.
certain
We do.
degree.
Yeah. So there has to be. It's way above my pay grade to say what the moral
It's
compass should be. That's for sure.
right,
But
obviously.
I can certainly understand that there's a need for one. And clearly, I'm Canadian. I live in the I'm pretty proud Canadian. I live here in a society that's basically been framed, and well, I shouldn't say framed, but I should say it has been we are the direct benefits of the United States' hegemony since, well, I guess pretty much they came into being, because Canada and the United States are very, very closely aligned in many different ways. So we are the benefits. I mean, the direct benefits of the moral compass that's been guiding the United States. And if you but that isn't, if I lived in China, I might be saying something different, right?
Yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
if I lived
Or in
in this,
Mexico, for
or
example,
Mexico's,
which is literally
yeah,
the other side, you
yeah. So
know?
there's so the problem with AI is, one of the problems is that it's all pervasive. Like, it's you can, and you can. I mean, it used to be really hard to spread your ideas. Like, think how hard the British Empire had to work to spread its ideas. Or forget that. For if you don't like the Brits, try the French. If you don't like the French, then how about the Dutch? If
Or
you
the
don't like those
Germans.
guys, or the Germans, or the Portuguese, or the Spanish, or the Phoenicians, or the Egyptians, or the Romans, the list goes on and on of civilizations that have sort of expanded, or the Comanches, and we just talked about those guys. But
Mhm.
um, uh, it was unbelievably difficult to promulgate your ideas, right, and your cultural norms. But that's all gone by the wayside. It's one of the, we mentioned earlier about one of the ways that social media can is changing the world, is that societal norms that are accepted in one country are being, can very easily bleed or be pushed into other cultures, right? And at the boundary of anything, there's always this turbulence and friction. So if AI, imagine how well. I mean, what did I say? Netflix took 3 years, 3.5 years to get to 1 million users. ChatGPT got 5 days. So think of how quickly that technology just blows into the world, all of
And
it,
it
all
progresses.
corners.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why this idea of a moral compass is really important, because firstly, it has to have one, otherwise it's just chaos and anything goes. And then what should that look like? Because whatever that might be, it has the potential to just blow through the world in the same way that ChatGPT blew through the world.
Yeah, and I mean, it's again, it's something that we're I kind of wanted to leave off with. When you go to even the very start of personal computers,
Mm,
you know, I mean, I'm 25, and strangely enough, I do remember when we had landlines. All right, and it was not fun. You used to have to turn off the phone in order to get on the internet. It was super slow, and there was AOL or there was Netscape. Like, but even as I got older, and you just for me to be able to see like, oh my god, there's a thing that I could just touch with my finger and it's a phone. That's cool. And even to that progression, we're able to even do something like this.
mhm.
You know, I know like you got people like even Joe Rogan that are like, oh, virtual podcast. That there is something that you can create from this, which is here. I'm sitting here in Florida. You're sitting there in Canada. We are able to have a conversation like as if
Mhm.
we're in the exact same room.
Yeah.
And I think that's also kind of part of the moral compass and the kind of the whole
Mhm.
part of the story is just
Yep.
like it
Yep.
took a personal computer to be $10,000 and all these variables and all these prompts to where we are now. We can kind of give that same morality and the same idea with artificial intelligence. And where are we
Yeah.
progressing in the future?
Yeah. I think that's a really, really that's a really beautiful insight, because one of the ways that we can have this conversation is that, okay, I'm going to talk to this guy. He's in a different country. He's older than me, a different generation, but we're going to find out if there's some common ground and if there's something that we can actually talk about that's interesting.
Yeah.
So what that is saying is that, okay, let's find some common ground based on some obvious ground rules, like show up, Bert. If you're supposed to be there at 10, Bert, you should be there at 10 and not 12, right? That's
Right.
like that's part of the moral compass. You expect me to be there at when this was scheduled.
Right.
So we're playing by this set of rules that we both understand, but we didn't actually have to
To abide
um,
to them. Yeah.
uh, yeah, so that's part of the moral compass, right? That's a good way to look at it. And one of the things, and again, that's one of the things that's unique to the United States, this idea that there's a First Amendment. You can have different ideas, but you're still allowed to speak, and
For
there's rules on
sure.
that, of course. But the point is that that's one of the underpinnings of this moral compass idea. This idea, if AI, if it's going to control, say, Twitter or Facebook or any other social media platform, it would have to allow diverse voices, right off the bat, with different
100%.
with differing
100%.
opinions.
Yeah, for sure.
And that makes sense to us, right? Because because you're an American. I grew up in Canada, where, like I said, we've been benefit from the hegemony of the United States, and the idea that the United States was the first to come up with this idea of free speech, and we benefit. So that has to be, in my mind, part of the moral compass. And you can see what happens when that gets when you pull that piece out of the pie, right? When you say, no, you can only talk about things that are important to me, and you can only talk about things that, you can only agree with me, which is part of this idea of, anything goes. I'm the most important thing. There's nothing greater than me.
Oh,
So
for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's
yeah.
just there's nothing. The thing is that everybody's going to voice their opinions and what they want to say, right? I'm very much in the philosophy of, instead of shutting the person up, let them talk. I don't give a damn if it's racist as hell. It doesn't matter. Let the damn person talk. And if there's a problem, right? Again, morality coming in, talk to the person.
Hmm.
Explain to them why you morally or personally feel that this is wrong, and why
Hmm.
other people kind of feel the same way too. It get like, I know this sounds so stupid. There's so many different things that can be solved by a simple conversation.
Hmm.
And that in itself is morality. I know that's
Oh,
bizarre.
no, I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, and human beings have a very fine track record of being wildly wrong. And we talked a little bit about physics. So in the late 1900s or 19th century, so around 1890, something like that, there was a guy by the name of Lord Rutherford, who was one of the preeminent physicists of that time, one of the greatest thinkers, actually, physical in terms of physics. And he said,
Hmm.
"Oh well, physics is over. There's nothing left to discover." So think about how brilliant that guy was, and he was brilliant in any way, every
Well,
way you can imagine, and how
you
wildly wrong he was,
you're dead wrong.
wildly dead wrong. And he'd be laughed. He couldn't say that. If he showed up on your doorstep and told you that, you'd laugh him. You'd laugh him all the way down the block,
I
even though
mean, look
it's
at all the
it's Lord
proof that we
Rutherford.
have. Yeah.
So so and if he were never allowed to speak and you were never allowed to hear him, we as a culture, as a society, would never know how wildly wrong that person was. Just like people believing the earth is flat, right? Or or
I don't understand it. I'm like, come
but
to
let them
Florida.
speak,
No,
right?
it's
Let them
like,
speak.
you know what the proof is? Just come to Florida, because of how flat Florida is. You can stand, look up, and you could literally see the sky is like a dome, because
Mhm.
like you still believe the Earth is flat, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that one of the things that's interesting about that, when Christopher Columbus sailed, he was probably the only supposedly learned man who thought the Earth was flat, because people had known for quite a long time that the Earth was round. The first person to figure it out was an Egyptian, I think around 1500 BC, and he calculated the radius and diameter of the Earth to within 1% using a very simple experiment that any high school kid could do. And Christopher Columbus, and everyone said the Earth is round there, buddy, but he didn't believe it. But to your point, All you need to do is look around, to find some of the bigger truths. But
And the curvatures. Definitely
yeah,
the curvatures.
yeah. But he was
Uh
allowed, Christopher was allowed to express himself, right? And
oh,
so, no,
for
no, the Earth is
sure.
flat. And so he had that conversation. I mean, the conversation was very big in the sense that it was this giant expedition. Cost Spain a fortune at the time. But the point is, he was allowed the freedom of expression, right, to do your thing, and then come back and make your claim. So that has to be part and parcel of the moral compass,
Oh,
just
for
just
sure.
like you described. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Question for you, because I know that
Mhm.
and you have a social media page. Do you have a website, if I'm not mistaken?
Sure. I have websites that are associated with my business, and I have websites that are associated with sort of the expeditions. If you just go to bertterhart.com, I guess you can sort of that would launch you into what I'm doing for a business, or what I'm doing on the expedition side of the fence. So yeah,
Have you
there's lots. I mean, sadly, if you were to Google my name, there's lots there. I you know,
have you been on any recent expeditions, or this was like, the prior past few years?
no, I was gone this summer. I was sailing out to the Aleutian Islands again this summer,
Okay.
and then coming in May, I'm getting in a canoe again and paddling from basically the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains out to the Arctic Ocean, and then down the coast. Um, and
Jesus.
and
That's a short trip, let me tell you.
Yeah, yeah, it's like 5,000 k. So anyway,
Wow. In a
but
canoe?
I'm doing that to
Solo? Or are you doing that with
solo.
other?
No, that's all solo.
Oh,
I
wow.
always and I'm not take well. I shouldn't say that. I'm pretty sure I have to take at least a GPS. Certainly when I'm in the Arctic. So, because it's too dangerous otherwise. But having said that, I mean, the whole idea is to look at what's happening on a very large scale in terms
Mhm.
of climate change in some of the areas of Canada that are most affected. So that's obviously the Arctic. It's having a look at some of the water quality issues that are in some of Canada's major watersheds. It's to shed some light as well on the role that Indigenous peoples played in putting Canada on the map, certainly as we know it, because we know the names of, like, obviously the Mackenzie River. That guy was a Brit, came to Canada, returned to Canada, but he wasn't able to do what he was able to do had it not been for Indigenous peoples living in those areas. Um, and they're and again, to help to get people to step outside and realize there's an amazing world right on our doorstep. All you have to do is go outside and choose to engage in some way, shape, or form.
I
Whether
think
that
s
engagement is doing what I'm doing, or just opening your eyes, like you had alluded to earlier, just saying, "Wow, this is an amazing place." I wonder if we're alone. Just look up at night. Everyone, I don't know anyone who's not wondered. I wonder what's out there. So one of the things I like to do is to encourage people to have that same childlike wonder when they step out into the world. And
Yeah.
uh,
It
so
really it really brings, a shed of light, or almost a personal connection, because, doing something like that, the only survival is what's around you.
mhm.
You have to be able to adapt and use whatever skills you can, which means you gotta rely on what gives us life every single
Yeah,
day,
yeah,
regardless.
you have to have a very good understanding of the moment, of the now.
Yeah.
So which is a really good lesson in life, actually, because if you can't actually be fully embedded in now, then you're probably oriented in the wrong direction. Either you're oriented into what was, which is you can't do anything about that, or what
No.
might be, which is above your pay grade, because
Yeah.
tomorrow, who knows what's going to be. Like,
We
I
don't
mean,
know.
we don't know. Like, what's an airplane going to look like? What are we going to eat? All these questions we don't
We'll
know.
find out.
And
We'll find out tomorrow.
yeah,
Yeah.
so the best thing to do is to be embedded in now. And when you're in those, when you're, if you're in the wilds, or in the bush, or it's the middle of winter, or living in Fargo, um, then you better be concerned about what's happening right now, because
Oh,
right now it can
yeah.
be really, really harsh, right? It
Yeah,
can be cold and miserable, and
you can't just stay
yeah.
on the couch on a
No.
Saturday night and eat your, Ben and Jerry's and just worry about the blizzard to blow over. It's not how it works.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you have your website. Do you have any social media at all, or?
Sure. Sure, you can well, there's social media associated with all the expeditions, so that's
Okay.
at Facebook, you can go to facebook.com/the5capes, and that'll be the circumnavigation, or facebook.com/across alone. That's about the canoe expedition across the country. If you go to facebook.com/leadbrain AI, that's this latest software company that I've launched. And or if you just were to Google my name itself, Bert TerHart, you'll be inundated with all kinds of things. So you
Well,
can find
you have
you
a
can
memorable name, so
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't think it's going to be hard.
Yeah. So there's lots of ways, for people to, if you wish to connect with me. I'm always very fascinated by the conversations I have with people that are either drawn to me for business reasons, or drawn to me for the expedition reasons, because it always sheds, for me, selfishly, I get a completely new perspective on what I've done. And it's always a perspective that I would not have possibly dreamt up myself. So the
Yeah.
conversations are always incredibly rewarding. And the rule is, if you email me, I'll email you back. So I mean, one of these,
That's a
so
good rule.
I still have kids who follow these other trips, who email me just about every week. So, and I answer them, because that's the rule. And of course, to me, it's really fun.
Oh yeah,
But
it's
it
awesome.
is. Yeah, I'm still in the phone book. You can still look me up
Oh
in
my
the web pages,
god.
because I have a landline. Because the power goes out here all the time. I live on a small island, so the power goes out here all the time.
Have you
Yeah.
gotten like a Starlink or anything where you are,
I'm
or?
Well, we do. I mean, Starlink. It's I would have got one when they first came out, but then they were limiting it to places in Canada where they really needed it, because we had internet connection already. But that's since changed. But Starlink I can tell you that Starlink is reshaping everything that we know. So, for example, I mentioned sailing off to the Aleutians this summer, and you don't come across very many boats in those places that are pleasure boats. It's all typically commercial boats. But every commercial boat I came across, and every other pleasure boat, had Starlink on it. Every other
Really?
one. Yeah, and it works at
Wow.
sea in the wildest places. And that's completely transforming how people are traveling to those places, and what they're doing when they get there. And there's both good, like everything, there's good and
Oh
bad. but
yeah, for
but
sure.
but I guess that's a long way of me. That's a long way, a roundabout way of me saying that I will have to have Starlink at some time, because it's independent of the grid, and we're dependent on the grid here. And the grid goes out every time the wind blows hard. Then the power lines stuff falls, just like Lahaina, stuff falls on the power lines,
Uh
and it goes
huh.
out. And then, so the last time the power was out was about 10 days ago, and it was out for a week, out for 7 days.
Jesus.
So that's nothing here. There's no way to cook, there's no way to get water, there's no way to heat the house except for wood. So I can't get on the internet, all these things. And
Crazy. But
we're
you know
like,
what? You get
razor's
to be
edge.
exactly. You get to be like a part of real nature. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
like your neighbor's a wee bit far away.
yeah.
Yeah.
You have to you get a healthy dose of reality as soon as the
Oh
power
yeah.
goes out.
Yeah. That's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, listen, Bert. It's been an absolute pleasure. I think you're so far the furthest person we've had on the podcast,
Wow.
if I'm not mistaken. So
Oh, that's pretty
congrats.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll
Um.
have to do it when I'm in a canoe somewhere. We'll have to rig
Oh
that
my
up.
god.
That would be hilarious.
I would love that. I would. Listen, if you got the Starlink, we got to do. I mean, we're not paid by Tesla or anything, but
Yeah.
definitely have to do like a little intro of that as well. But
Yeah.
listen,
Yeah.
it's been an absolute pleasure. If anyone wants to check out more of the podcast, you can find us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Also, the Pod. So with that, catch you on the next one. Peace out.